The tray in my hands was shaking before I even understood why. I am Ella Whitmore, and on the day everything changed, I was standing in a hallway of polished black stone, carrying a tray of nectar cups toward the private chambers of Princess Vesyrion, heir to the Cathari Dominion. I had worked in this palace for 3 years. I knew every guard's footstep, every servant's whisper, every sound the building made when it settled at night. And that morning, the building made a sound I had never heard before. A low hum coming from beneath the floor, gone before I could place it. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak. Old empires creak louder. I kept walking. The Cathari were not like us. They stood a head taller than the tallest human, with skin like brushed copper and eyes that could see heat the way we see color. They had built an empire across 9 star systems before my ancestors had learned to smelt iron. To them, humans were a curiosity, a useful one, since we asked for little and complained less, but a curiosity all the same. We cooked, we cleaned, we carried trays down long stone hallways, and we were not expected to notice anything beyond the trays themselves. That suited me fine. Being underestimated is a strange kind of gift. Nobody watches you closely when they already believe they know exactly what you are. Princess Vesa was 17 by her people's counting, which made her close enough to my own age that I never fully thought of her as royalty, no matter how many times the court reminded me to bow lower and speak less. She was sitting by her window when I entered, staring out at the twin suns setting over the capital, and she did not turn around. "You heard it too," she said, "the hum." I set the tray down carefully. "I heard something. I do not know what it was." "Neither do I," she turned then, and there was something behind her eyes that I rarely saw in the Cathari nobility. Worry. Real worry. Not the performed concern they used in front of cameras and councils. "My uncle says it is nothing. The engineers say it is nothing. Everyone says it is nothing, Ella. And yet, nobody will look me in the eye when they say it." I poured her a cup of nectar and said nothing, because saying nothing is often the safest thing a servant can say. But I was thinking I had grown up on Earth listening to my grandfather's stories about war, about how the quietest rooms are often the ones right before something breaks. He had been a soldier once, long before humanity ever met another species among the stars. And he used to say that danger rarely announces itself with noise. It announces itself with silence in places that should not be silent. The palace that morning was too quiet, in exactly that way. "They gave you 3 new guards this week," I said carefully. "That is a great many for someone who is supposedly not in danger." Vessa's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Formation guards, my uncle's idea. He says the succession vote is close, and closeness makes people nervous, and nervous people hire guards." She took the cup from my hands, her copper fingers brushing mine. "Do you know what a Cathari blade guard trains for, Ella? I have watched them drill, sword work, reflex tests, strength contests. Since birth," she said, "since the moment they are old enough to stand, they are shaped for exactly one purpose: to fight anyone who might threaten the throne. There has not been a successful attack on a member of the royal family in over 200 years. 200 years, Ella. They are the finest warriors in 9 systems." I thought about the hum beneath the floor and did not answer right away. "You do not look comforted by that," she said. "I am comforted," I said, which was not entirely a lie. "I only wonder if 200 years of nothing happening might make a guard a little slow to notice when something finally does." She laughed, a real laugh, bright and surprised, and for a moment the worry left her face entirely. "You say things no one else in this palace would dare say to me." "That is because no one else in this palace would dare think it," I said, and that made her laugh again. I liked Vesa. I want to be honest about that from the very start, because it explains everything that came after. I had not planned to care about her. I had taken this position because the pay was good and the work was steady, and humanity needed every credit it could earn from these older, wealthier civilizations if we ever wanted a real seat at the table among the stars. But 3 years of pouring her nectar, of listening to her worries about a crown she had never asked to wear, of being the only person in the palace who spoke to her like a person instead of a political prize, had made her something closer to family than employer. So when she was frightened, I was frightened too. I simply did not show it the way she did. The 3 new guards were waiting outside her chamber. When I left an hour later, standing in that particular stillness, the Cathari warriors were famous for, spine straight, eyes forward, hands resting near the hilts of blades that had never once, as far as I knew, been drawn in true combat. Their captain was a broad-shouldered Cathari named Draven Illies, decorated twice for tournament victories, and he gave me the smallest nod as I passed, which was more courtesy than most guards bothered with. "Careful with the tray, little one," he said, not unkindly. "Wouldn't want you dropping royal nectar on royal floors." "I have carried heavier things than nectar, Captain," I said. He smiled the way adults smile at a child who has said something clever but untrue. "I am certain you have." I did not correct him. There was no point. In his mind, and in the mind of every noble in that palace, a human maid was the least dangerous object in any given room, less threatening than the furniture, because at least the furniture did not need to be told where to stand. I let him believe it. I had learned over 3 years that being dismissed was the safest place to stand. That evening, over dinner in the servants' quarters, I sat with 2 other humans who worked in the palace kitchens, a quiet man named Nathan Ellery and a sharp-tongued woman named Grace Oswin, and I told them about the machinery, Nathan said without much interest. "This place is 1,000 years old. Something is always groaning somewhere." "It did not sound like machinery," I said. Grace looked up from her plate, studying me the way she sometimes did, like she was trying to decide whether I was worth worrying about. "You get a feeling about things, Ella, you always have. Remember when you told the head cook the eastern storage room smelled wrong 3 days before the pipe burst? That was a smell. This was a sound. Same instinct," she said. "What does your gut say?" I set down my fork. "My gut says something is coming, and that everyone in this palace who is supposed to protect the princess is too confident to notice it arriving." Nathan snorted the blade guards. "Ella, those men could take apart a warship with their bare hands. What exactly do you think a human maid understands about danger that they do not?" It was a fair question, and I did not have a clean answer for it that night. All I had was the memory of my grandfather's voice telling stories about ambushes and misdirection, about how the strongest army in the world can still lose to a smaller one that simply thinks differently. The Cathari had never needed to think differently. They had never lost. 200 years of victory teaches a warrior exactly one lesson, and it is not humility. I went to bed that night with the hum still echoing somewhere in the back of my mind, faint and distant, like a held breath. The following days brought more of the same unease, small and easy to dismiss individually, impossible to ignore altogether. A serving droid in the East Wing moved with a stutter in its gait that the maintenance crew could not explain and did not seem interested in investigating further. 2 guards were quietly reassigned from the princess's detail without explanation, replaced by unfamiliar faces from a garrison across the capital. Council members who used to greet Vesa warmly in the corridors now offered only stiff, careful nods, the kind people give when they know something they are not permitted to say. And there was talk, servant talk, the kind that travels through kitchens and hallways faster than any official channel, about Lord Cassian Vaughn, cousin to the ruling family, whose branch of the bloodline had lost the throne 3 generations ago in a vote that some still called unjust. Lord Cassian had been quiet for years. Lately, he had not been quiet at all. He had been visiting the capital often, meeting with council members late into the night, smiling a great deal in public in a way that made the older servants uneasy. "He smiles like a man who already knows how a story ends," Grace told me one evening as we folded linens together in the servants' hall. "I do not trust a man who smiles like that. I trusted my instincts, and my instincts told me the same thing." A grand gala was announced for the following week, a celebration meant to reassure the public and the council that the succession dispute was nothing more than politics as usual, that the Cathari Dominion remained strong and united under Vesa's family. Every noble house would attend. Every guard in the capital would be on duty. It was meant to be a show of strength. I remember thinking as I helped prepare Vesa's gown for the evening that a show of strength is exactly the kind of event someone plans an attack around. Not despite the extra guards, but because of them. Because everyone from the captain of the Blade Guards down to the newest recruit would be watching the crowd for signs of protest or rebellion, for angry council members and disgruntled citizens. Nobody would be watching for the one thing the Cathari had never needed to guard against in 200 years of unbroken peace. Something quiet, something patient, something that did not look like a threat until it was already too late to stop. I did not know yet what shape that threat would take. I only knew, standing in Vessa's chamber with a gown draped over my arm, and that same faint hum returning somewhere deep beneath the palace floor, that whatever was coming, the finest warriors in 9 systems were not looking in the right direction to see it arrive, and I was the only one in that entire palace who seemed to notice. Vessa caught me staring at nothing, my hand still holding the gown, and she frowned. "Ella," she said softly, "what is it?" I forced a small smile. "The kind servants learn to produce on command. Nothing, your grace, only thinking about the gala, but that was not true." I was thinking about the hum and Lord Cassion's smile, and the 2 reassigned guards, and the strange stutter in the serving droid's step, and how every single one of those small dismissible things fit together into a shape I recognized from my grandfather's stories. A shape the Cathari, for all their strength and all their pride, had never once been trained to see. I finished dressing her in silence, and I said nothing more about it that night because there was nothing yet to say that anyone would believe. But I made a private decision as I laid out her jewelry, one I did not share with Vessa or with Grace or with anyone at all. Whatever was coming to that gala, I intended to be paying closer attention than anyone else in the room. The 200 years of Cathari peace was about to end, and none of their celebrated guards had the faintest idea it was already beginning. The hallway outside Vessa's chamber hummed again that night, low and steady, like something breathing beneath the stone, and this time I did not tell myself it was nothing at all. The Blade Guards trained in the eastern courtyard every morning at dawn, and I had watched them enough times over 3 years to know their routine by heart. They moved in perfect unison, blades flashing silver under the twin suns, muscles honed by decades of discipline that no ordinary being could match. Watching them was like watching a machine built entirely from flesh and pride, and I understood completely why the Cathari Dominion feared nothing. Why would they? No army in 9 systems had ever broken their formation in open combat, but I was not watching for their strength that week. I was watching for their weaknesses, and once I started looking, I found them everywhere. Captain Draven Eli's ran his warriors through the same drills every single morning, the same footwork, the same blocking patterns, the same responses to the same imagined attacks. When one of the younger guards suggested varying the drill to include unpredictable movement, Draven laughed him off the training floor. "We do not need to imagine chaos," he said, loud enough for me to hear from the servants' walkway above the courtyard. "Chaos has never once defeated us. Discipline defeats chaos." Every time I thought about my grandfather again, about the stories he told of ambushes that succeeded precisely, because the defenders trusted their discipline too completely, expecting the enemy to fight the same way they always had. Discipline is strong against an enemy who plays by the same rules. It is far weaker against an enemy who refuses to play by any rules at all. There was something else I noticed, something the guards themselves would never have admitted, and something no Cathari scholar had apparently ever bothered to record in any manual. The Cathari did not hear the way humans did. Their primary sense for detecting nearby movement in darkness or confusion was not sight or sound, but a kind of vibration sense felt through small organs along their forearms and the base of their necks, something like a heightened awareness of pressure changes in the air. It made them extraordinary fighters in open-lit spaces, able to sense an opponent's intention half a second before a strike landed. But Grace, of all people, was the one who told me the detail that changed everything. "My cousin married a Cathari engineer," she said one evening as we scrubbed pots in the kitchen after a long day. "He told her something strange once about how their vibration sense gets confused in true darkness combined with sudden temperature shifts. Something about the organs needing a stable baseline in pitch black with no reliable air pressure. They are nearly as blind as we are, maybe worse. Nearly as blind as us, I repeated slowly. Grace shrugged, not understanding why my hands had gone still in the dishwater. It is not something that ever comes up. Their whole empire is lit like a festival, day and night. When would it matter? I did not answer her right away because I was thinking about the gala, about grand ballrooms with soaring ceilings, about how a room built for celebration always has more shadows and more variables than a training courtyard built for discipline. I was thinking out how confident an army becomes after 200 years without defeat, and how confidence more than any weapon is the thing that finally brings an empire down. I did not know yet how the attack would come. I only knew with a certainty I could not fully explain that it would come through that blind spot in a place bright enough to look safe and dark enough in the right corners to hide something patient. 3 days before the gala, I overheard something I was never meant to hear. I had been sent to deliver linens to a storage room near the lower kitchens, a part of the palace rarely used except by cleaning staff. And as I approached the door, I heard voices on the other side, low and careful. I recognized one voice immediately, Lord Cassie Vaughan. The other voice I did not recognize at all, rough and unfamiliar with the flat, careful cadence of someone choosing every word with precision. The jamming field will hold for the length of the gala. The unfamiliar voice said long enough. Their guards will not sense us until it is finished. And the girl, Cashin asked. The princess is the only target that matters. Everyone else in that room is simply an obstacle. I stood frozen outside that door with a stack of linens pressed against my chest, my heart hammering so loudly I feared they might somehow hear it through the wall the way the Cathari heard through the air. I did not move. I did not breathe. I waited until the voices fell silent and footsteps moved away down a different corridor. And only then did I finally allow myself to step back quietly, carefully, and walk away in the opposite direction. I did not have proof. I heard two voices in a storage room and a feeling in my stomach that had never once been wrong. I understood immediately that going to Captain Draven with what I had heard would accomplish nothing. A human maid claiming she overheard a conspiracy against the crown would be dismissed within seconds, or worse, reported as a troublemaker spreading dangerous rumors about a respected noble house. I had no title, no rank, no evidence beyond my own ears. So I went to the only person in that palace who had ever actually listened to me. Vesa was in her private study when I found her reviewing council documents by lamplight, and she looked up the moment I entered, reading something in my face before I had said a single word. "Ella," she said, setting down the documents, "you look like you have seen a ghost." I told her everything. The hum beneath the floor, the stutter in the serving droid, the reassigned guards, Lord Cashin's smile, the two voices behind the storage room door and the words jamming field, and the princess is the only target that matters. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing paler with every sentence. And when I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You believe my own cousin means to have me killed at my own gala?" "I believe someone does," I said carefully. "And I believe your cousin is involved somehow. I cannot prove it. I only know what I heard and what I have felt building in this palace for 2 weeks. My uncle will not believe a servant's overheard conversation," Vesa said quietly, "not against a member of the ruling council. He will say it is exactly the kind of thing an anxious young woman imagines before a public event." She looked up at me, and there was something steady in her eyes now, something that had not been there the day of the hum. "But I believe you, Ella. I have always believed you, even when I should not have. Then cancel the gala." "I cannot. If I cancel now with no proof beyond a rumor, it will look exactly like fear. And fear is the one thing my family cannot afford to show the council right now. If Cashin truly means to move against me, canceling the gala only delays the attempt. It does not stop it." She stood, smoothing the front of her gown with hands that were not quite steady. "But I can prepare, and this time I will not rely only on Draven's blades to keep me safe." She looked at me in a way she never had before, something between gratitude and calculation. the look of someone recalculating exactly how much they had underestimated the person standing in front of them. "Stay close to me at the gala," she said. "Closer than protocol allows. I do not care what the council says about a maid standing too near the princess. I trust your instincts more than I trust 200 years of unbroken victory." I agreed, though I did not yet know what staying close would actually require of me. In the days that followed, I found small ways to prepare quietly without drawing attention. I studied the layout of the grand ballroom where the gala would be held, memorizing exits, memorizing which corners fell into deep shadow once the ceremonial lights dimmed for the evening toasts. I noticed during a brief tour of the venue with the event staff, several ornamental braziers positioned along the walls meant purely for decoration, each one holding real flame rather than the sea. Old artificial light the Cathari usually preferred. Real flame meant real heat. Real heat meant sudden temperature shifts, exactly the kind of thing Grace's cousin had described disrupting the Cathari vibration sense. I did not know yet whether that detail would matter. I only knew that I would rather notice too much than too little. The night before the gala, I could not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the small servant's room I shared with Grace, running through every detail I had gathered, every warning sign, every fragment of overheard conversation, trying to build them into something solid enough to trust. Grace stirred beside me, half asleep. "You are thinking too loudly, Ella. I can hear it from over here. Tomorrow night," I said quietly, "something is going to happen. I do not know exactly what. I only know I am the only person in that palace who seems to be looking in the right direction." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over in the darkness and found my hand, squeezing it once firmly. "Then look carefully," she said. "And Ella, whatever happens, do not wait for permission to act. Nobody in that palace has ever given you permission for anything, and you have still managed to be right about everything that matters." I held on to those words the following evening, as I dressed in my formal servant's uniform, dark fabric with silver trim meant to make the household staff nearly invisible against the walls of the grand ballroom. I helped Vesa into her gown, a deep blue that matched the twin moons rising outside her window, and I watched her hands tremble slightly as I fastened the final clasp at her shoulder. "Are you frightened?" I asked quietly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but less frightened than I would be without you standing beside me tonight." We walked together toward the grand ballroom as the first guests began to arrive. Golden lights spilling from tall arched doorways, music already drifting through the corridors. The entire palace dressed in celebration for an evening meant to prove to 9 systems that the Cathari Dominion remained strong, unshaken, and utterly secure. Captain Draven stood at the entrance in full ceremonial armor, his warriors arranged around the perimeter of the ballroom exactly as tradition demanded, blades polished, eyes forward, confident in 200 years of unbroken peace. I stood a half-step behind Vesa's shoulder, closer than any servant was traditionally permitted to stand, and I let my eyes move slowly across the room, past the glittering crowd of nobles in their finest colors, past the orchestra tuning their instruments, past the tall ornamental braziers burning steadily along the walls, until they settled on the deep shadowed corners near the ceiling where the celebration lights did not quite reach. Something in those shadows felt wrong. I could not have said exactly what. I only knew, standing there in my dark uniform with silver trim, that the hum I had first heard weeks ago beneath the palace floor had finally quietly arrived in the very room where I was standing. The orchestra began to play, and the gala officially began. And somewhere above us, in shadows that no Cathari eye or vibration sense could properly reach, something patient was waiting for exactly the right moment to move. The first hour of the gala passed exactly as every gala before it had passed. Nobles drifted between conversations with their crystal goblets. The orchestra played something slow and formal, and Captain Draven's warriors stood along the walls like statues carved from copper and pride. Vesa moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting council members, accepting compliments on her gown, smiling in all the ways her position required. I stayed close behind her shoulder the entire time, watching the shadowed corners near the ceiling, watching the tall braziers burning steadily along the walls, watching Lord Cashin Vaughn, who stood near the far end of the room with a goblet in his hand and a smile that Grace had once described perfectly. He smiled like a man who already knew how a story ended. I noticed the moment the ceremonial lights began to dim for the evening toast, a tradition meant to draw every eye toward the raised platform where Vessa's uncle would speak. The great chandeliers along the ceiling lowered their glow gradually, softening the room into a warm, golden dimness meant to feel intimate rather than threatening. Nobody else seemed to notice how the shadows in the high corners deepened at exactly the same moment, or how the temperature near the tall arched windows shifted slightly as a breeze slipped through vents that should not have been open at all. I felt it before I heard anything. A faint pressure change in the air, the kind you feel before a storm, subtle enough that I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. Then the first brazier along the eastern wall flared unexpectedly high, its flame doubling in size for just a moment before settling. G again, and I understood immediately that it was not decoration causing that flare. Something had disturbed the air around it, something moving through space that should have been empty. Vessa, I whispered, stepping close enough that only she could hear me. Something is happening right now. She had learned over the past week to trust the tone of my voice more than she trusted her own eyes. Where? Everywhere, I said. The shadows near the ceiling, the air near the windows. I think they are already inside the room. Her uncle rose at that moment on the raised platform, lifting his goblet to begin the evening toast, and the entire ballroom turned its attention toward him, exactly as tradition demanded, exactly as whoever had planned this attack must have known they would. That was when the lights failed completely. Not dimmed, failed. Every chandelier in the grand ballroom went dark at once, plunging 400 nobles into a blackness, so sudden that the room filled instantly with startled gasps and the clatter of dropped goblets. Only the braziers remained lit, scattered flickers of orange flame along the walls, throwing wild moving shadows across a room that had moments before been full of golden light. I grabbed Vessa's arm and pulled her down and back away from the open center of the room toward the relative cover of a long banquet table near the eastern wall. She did not resist. She trusted me completely by then, and in that moment, trust was the only thing keeping her alive. Around us, chaos began to unfold in ways the Cathari guards were entirely unprepared to handle. I heard Captain Draven shouting orders, his voice sharp with the first real alarm I had ever heard from him. But his warriors, trained for 200 years to sense the vibration and pressure of an approaching enemy, moved with a strange, dangerous hesitation. Their weapons were drawn. Their bodies were positioned in perfect defensive formation, but their eyes darted uncertainly through the darkness, and I understood with a cold clarity that Grace's cousin had been exactly right. In true darkness, combined with the sudden temperature shifts pouring through the open vents, the Cathari sense for danger had gone nearly blind. The attackers moved through that blindness like it was an invitation. I could not see them clearly at first, only impressions, shapes moving at the edge of the brazier light, fast and precise, wearing something that bent and scattered the little illumination that remained. One of the younger blade guards near the platform turned sharply, blade raised, sensing something a half-second too late, and was struck across the shoulder by an attacker who seemed to simply appear from nowhere and vanish again just as quickly. The guard went down hard, his blade clattering across the marble floor, and the crowd's panic rose another degree. Formation, Draven roared, trying to rally his warriors into the tight defensive wall that had never once failed them in 200 years of ceremonial duty. But a defensive wall depends on knowing where the enemy stands. And in that darkness, with pressure and heat scrambling every instinct they had ever trained, the Cathari guards could not tell friend from stranger, could not tell empty air from approaching danger until the danger was already past their blades and moving toward its true target. I watched a second guard fall near the banquet table closest to us, not struck by any blade I could see, simply swept off balance and pinned before he could recover his footing. A third guard swung wildly at a shape that turned out to be nothing more than shifting shadow from a brazier flame, wasting the one clean strike he might have landed on an actual threat. They were the finest warriors in 9 systems, and in that room, in that darkness, they were fighting an enemy their training had never once prepared them to face. "Stay behind me," I told Vesa, my voice steadier than I felt. "Ella, you have no weapon, you have no training, you are a maid." "I'm also the only person in this room who saw this coming," I said, and I meant it because in that moment, being underestimated felt less like a limitation and more like the only advantage I had left. I scanned the space around us quickly, the way my grandfather used to describe scanning a room before it became a battlefield. A serving cart stood nearby, abandoned by a fleeing attendant, holding empty crystal goblets and a half-full pitcher of nectar. A long silver serving tray lay across its surface, heavy, flat, solid, not a weapon by any Cathari standard, but solid things swung with enough force and enough surprise do not need to be elegant to be useful. I grabbed the tray. A shape moved through the shadows toward the banquet table where Vesa crouched low and fast, deliberate in a way that told me immediately this was no confused guest fleeing the chaos. This was one of them. I could not see a face, only the bending, shifting outline of something wearing technology built to scat. Our light and confuse pressure senses. Technology built specifically to defeat Cathari perception and nothing else in the galaxy. It had never been built to fool a human eye, trained by nothing more advanced than years of careful watching. I saw the shape's outline hesitate for half a second as it registered Vesa's position, gathering itself for whatever came next, and I did not wait to find out what that was. I swung the serving tray with everything I had, catching the shape hard across what I judged, by instinct alone, to be the side of its head. The impact rang through the metal tray and up my arms, and the shape staggered sideways with a sound of genuine surprise, crashing into the edge of the banquet table and knocking crystal goblets shattering across the marble floor. For one heartbeat, the entire ballroom around us seemed to freeze. Captain Draven's head snapped toward the sound, his warriors' formation faltering even further in their confusion. And somewhere in the chaos, I heard Lord Cassion's voice rise sharply, urgent, in a way that told me he had not expected things to unfold quite this messily. The attacker I had struck recovered faster than I expected, rising with a low, furious sound, and I understood immediately that one lucky strike with a serving tray was not going to be enough to end this. There were more shapes moving through the darkness around us, more attackers pressing through the confusion, and the Cathari guards could not seem to overcome, and Vesa was still crouched behind me with nothing but her own 2 hands to defend herself. I planted my feet, gripped the tray tighter, and understood with total clarity that whatever training the Cathari guards lacked for this exact moment, I was going to have to make up for with nothing but instinct, improvisation, and a refusal to let this princess die on a ballroom floor. While the finest warriors in 9 systems fumbled through darkness, they had never once been trained to survive. The attacker steadied itself and turned fully toward me. And for the first time since the lights had failed, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. It was cold and it was clear, and it told me exactly what I needed to do next. Behind me, Draven's warriors were still fighting shadows and losing. Around me, 400 nobles screamed and scattered through darkness, lit only by scattered flame. And in front of me, an assassin trained to defeat the greatest warriors in the galaxy, was learning for the first time that he had never once trained to face a human maid who refused to run. I swung the tray again. The second strike landed across the attacker's forearm as he raised it to block, and the tray bent under the force of the blow, but it did its work. He staggered back a step, and in that brief opening, I finally understood something useful about the technology he wore. The suit that scattered light and confused pressure sensing needed a steady field to function properly, the same way Grace's cousin had described the Cathari senses, needing a stable baseline to read the world around them. Every time I struck him, every sudden jolt of impact, The shifting outline around his body flickered just for an instant before settling again. He was not invisible. He was simply difficult to hold still in anyone's perception, mine included, but difficult was not impossible. And I had exactly one advantage none of the blade guards possessed. I was not trying to sense him the way the Cathari did, through pressure and vibration in open air. I was watching him. The plain, simple way any human watches anything, with my eyes fixed on movement and shape, refusing to blink, refusing to look away, even when the shifting light made my head ache with the effort of tracking him. "Vesa, stay low and stay against the table," I said without turning around, because turning around was the one thing I could not afford to do. The attacker recovered his footing and came at me again, faster this time, and I realized quickly that a serving tray alone was not going to be enough against someone with real training, however confused his enhanced perception had become. I needed more than one tool. I needed the room itself. I remembered the picture of Nectar still sitting on the abandoned serving cart beside me. And I remembered with sudden clarity exactly what Grace's cousin had said about temperature shifts disrupting the Cathari senses. If cold air and sudden pressure changes could confuse even a trained Cathari warrior's perception, there was no reason the same principle would not disorient technology built to mimic and exploit that same biological blind spot. I grabbed the picture and threw its contents directly at the shifting outline in front of me. The effect was immediate and startling. The sudden splash of liquid against whatever material formed his suit caused the bending light around him to flicker violently, the shape solidifying for a full second before scattering again. And in that single second of clarity, I saw him completely. A lean, armored figure, faceless behind a dark visor, one arm raised instinctively to wipe liquid from whatever sensors allowed his suit to function. 1 second was enough. I closed the distance and swung the bent serving tray with everything my arms could give it, catching him squarely across the side of his helmet. He dropped hard, his suit flickering wildly and then failing altogether, revealing an ordinary man beneath the illusion, stunned and still on the marble floor. I did not have time to feel triumphant. Somewhere behind me, I heard Vesa gasp, and I spun to find a second attacker emerging from the deeper shadows near the collapsed banquet table, moving directly toward her while I had been occupied. I had no tray left worth swinging, bent nearly flat from the impact. But I had learned something valuable in those last few minutes. These attackers depended entirely on confusion, on shadows and disrupted senses, and the assumption that no one in that ballroom would be capable of tracking them clearly enough to fight back. They had planned for Cathari guards blinded by darkness. They had never once planned for a human who did not rely on Cathari senses at all. I grabbed one of the tall brazier stands nearby, knocking it toward the approaching attacker with both hands, sending scattered embers and open flame directly into his path. He recoiled instinctively from the fire, his suit's shifting camouflage flaring bright and unstable in the sudden heat. And Vesa, to her credit, did not simply wait to be saved. She grabbed a broken piece of the banquet table's edge, splintered from the earlier collision, and drove it hard into the attacker's exposed side as he stumbled back from the flame. He went down beside his companion, and for a moment the two of us stood together over two disabled attackers, breathing hard, surrounded by chaos. We had somehow managed to survive, but the gala's disaster was not finished. Across the ballroom, I could see Captain Draven and his remaining warriors still struggling in the deeper darkness near the raised platform, fighting an enemy their training could not locate, taking hits they could not predict. Their formation broken entirely into desperate, isolated struggles. I counted at least 3 more shifting outlines moving through that chaos, converging steadily toward the platform where Vesa's uncle stood exposed and undefended. His own guards too occupied to reach him in time. "They are not only after me," Vesa said breathless, following my gaze toward the platform. "They mean to take my uncle as well and end the succession dispute entirely in one single night." I looked at the bent tray in my hands, at the two attackers unconscious on the floor beside us, and I made a decision that surprised even myself. "Stay here behind the fallen table," I told Vesa firmly. "Do not move from this spot no matter what you hear. Ella, you cannot." "I already have," I said, and I left her there before she could argue further, moving low and fast across the chaotic ballroom floor toward the platform, gripping the ruined tray like it was the finest blade in the Dominion's armory. The remaining attackers had clearly identified the platform as their true objective, and Draven's exhausted warriors were failing to hold them back, each guard fighting alone in darkness that scrambled every instinct they possessed. I reached the edge of the platform just as one shifting outline lunged toward Vesa's uncle, who stood frozen, unarmed, a nobleman never once trained for personal combat in 200 years of assumed safety. I threw myself between them without thinking, swinging the tray upward and catching the attacker's raised arm before it could complete its strike. The impact staggered him, and I used the same trick that had worked before, grabbing a nearby bowl of ceremonial water meant for the evening toast and hurling its contents directly at his flickering camouflage. The suit destabilized instantly, and I struck him solidly across the chest with the flat of the tray, driving him back into the platform's edge, hard enough that he did not rise again. Draven appeared beside me then, finally landing a clean strike of his own, now that the sudden clarity of the destabilized suit had given his warrior senses something solid to finally track. Together, without a word passing between us, we turned to face the last two attackers converging on the platform. And for the first time that night, I saw something shift in the captain's expression as he glanced at me, bent tray in hand, standing my ground beside him. It was not quite respect yet, but it was no longer dismissal either. "Copy what she does," Draven shouted to his remaining warriors, a command I doubted he ever imagined giving in his entire life. "Disrupt their suits, water, fire, anything that breaks their field. Do not wait for your senses to find them. Watch for movement instead the way she does." It was clumsy ice delivered under pressure by warriors who had never once needed to fight this way. But clumsy advice was better than none, and slowly, imperfectly, the tide of the fight began to shift. Guards who moments earlier had been swinging blindly at shadows began disrupting the attacker's camouflage with whatever came to hand, catching brief flickers of clarity long enough to land solid strikes. I fought beside them through the final minutes of that chaotic battle, using the ruined tray, using thrown liquid, using anything within reach, my arms aching and my breath ragged. But I did not stop because stopping was never an option I allowed myself to consider. One by one, the remaining attackers fell, disabled and stripped of the advantage that had let them walk so confidently, into a room full of the galaxy's finest warriors. When the last one finally went still on the marble floor, the ballroom fell into a strange ringing silence, broken only by scattered coughing and the crackle of the braziers, still burning steadily along the walls. Somewhere, emergency lighting flickered weakly to life, casting pale illumination across a room that had been only minutes before a celebration of unity and strength. I stood near the platform, breathing hard, the bent remains of a serving tray still clutched in my aching hands, surrounded by disabled attackers and exhausted Cathari warriors who were staring at me with expressions I had never once seen, directed at a human maid in 3 years of palace service. Vesa pushed through the crowd toward me, her gown torn at the hem, a shallow scrape along her arm from the splintered table edge, but very much alive and very much unharmed in any way that truly mattered. She reached me and without any regard for protocol or propriety, wrapped her arms around me tightly in front of her entire assembled court. "You saved my life," she said quietly, her voice shaking now that the danger had finally passed. "You saved my uncle's life. You saved this entire room." Captain Draven approached slowly, his ceremonial armor scratched and dented, his pride visibly bruised in a way his armor never could be. He looked down at me for a long moment, and then to the genuine shock of everyone still watching, he lowered his head in a small formal bow, the same bow he would offer to an equal. 20 years, he said quietly, and my warriors were nearly defeated in a single night by an enemy we never once trained to face, and a maid we never once respected saved us all. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all and simply stood there, exhausted and aching, beside the princess I had sworn, without ever saying the words aloud, to protect with everything I had. The days after the gala passed in a blur of council meetings, formal inquiries, and a palace so thick with tension that even the servants' quarters felt watched. Lord Cashinval was arrested within hours. His private communications recovered and cross-referenced with the surviving attackers who, once stripped of their disrupted camouflage suits and questioned, thoroughly offered little resistance to confirming exactly who had hired them and why. The plan had been simple in its ambition and nearly successful in its execution. Remove Vesa and her uncle in one coordinated strike. Exploit a jamming field to blind the palace's sensors, and let the resulting chaos hand the succession vote to a branch of the family that had waited 3 generations for exactly this opportunity. What none of the planners had accounted for was a maid who noticed a hum beneath the floor 2 weeks before anyone else thought to worry about it. I was summoned before the full council 5 days after the attack. An experience that would have terrified me under any other circumstances, standing in a chamber full of Cathari nobility, who until recently had considered me barely worth acknowledging. Vesa stood beside me the entire time, close enough that her presence alone told the room exactly where her loyalty stood, and her uncle, still shaken but composed, addressed the gathered council directly. This young woman identified a threat that 200 years of training failed to notice, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. She acted with more courage and more clarity than warriors bred for exactly this purpose. I do not intend to let that go unrecognized simply because tradition says a human servant does not deserve recognition. There was murmuring among the council, some of it skeptical, some of it grudging, but none of it strong enough to override what every single person in that room had already heard from a dozen different sources. The story of the human maid who fought off trained assassins with nothing but a serving tray and quick thinking had already spread through the capital faster than any official announcement could have managed. Captain Draven himself stood before the council that day and spoke words I never expected to hear from him. Our training assumed an Nemi would come as we always understood danger to come, sensed through vibration and pressure met with strength and formation. He said, "We have spent 200 years perfecting a defense against threats we already knew how to recognize. We have never once trained to face an enemy who understood exactly how to become invisible to senses we assumed were infallible." If not for Ella Whitmore's instincts and her willingness to act without waiting for permission or proof, this entire dominion would be mourning both its princess and its regent tonight, and beginning what I suspect would have become a long and bloody war over succession. He turned to look at me directly, then in front of the entire council. "I misjudged you completely, and I misjudged your people alongside you. I believed strength and training were the only measures of a warrior worth watching closely. I was wrong, and I do not say that easily." The council eventually agreed to a formal reform of the Blade Guard training program, incorporating exactly the kind of unpredictable sense-defeating tactics that had nearly ended the Dominion's ruling family in a single night. Human instructors, myself included, were invited to consult on the new training methods, teaching warriors who had spent their entire lives certain of their own supremacy how to fight without relying on senses that could, under the right circumstances, be turned completely against them. It was strange teaching Cathari warriors twice my size and infinitely stronger than I would ever be how to watch a room the way my grandfather had once taught me with plain eyes and patient attention, rather than trained instinct alone. Stranger still was watching those same proud warriors listen carefully to every word I said, taking notes, adjusting drills, treating a human maid's observations as seriously as any lesson passed down through 200 years of tradition. Word of the gala spread far beyond the Cathari Dominion, carried by traders and diplomats to a dozen other systems, and I began hearing secondhand how other governments across the galaxy were quietly reconsidering their assumptions about humanity. We had no claws, no venom, no enhanced senses, no centuries of trained superiority. But we had proven in one chaotic night in a darkened ballroom that adaptability and refusal to quit could matter more than any biological advantage an older, prouder species had ever possessed. Grace found me in the kitchens a week after the gala, grinning in a way I had not seen from her in months. "They are saying humans might get a formal seat on the Interesse's Council within the decade," she said, setting down a tray of fresh bread. All because a maid with a serving tray refused to stand still while a princess needed help. "I only did what anyone would have done," I said. "No," Grace said firmly, shaking her head. "You did what almost nobody in that entire palace was willing to do. You paid attention when everyone around you assumed there was nothing worth noticing. That is not nothing, Ella. That might be the most important thing any of us can do." Vesa found me later that same evening, standing alone on a balcony overlooking the capital, watching the twin suns, set exactly as they had the day this entire story began. She joined me quietly, leaning against the railing beside me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "My uncle has offered you a formal position," she said eventually. "Advisor to the crown with full rank and full protection under Cathari law. You would never need to carry a serving tray again unless you wished to." I considered that for a moment, watching the light fade slowly over the city. "And what would you offer me, Vesa? Not the crown. You." She turned to face me fully, and there was something in her expression I recognized immediately. The same real worry I had seen the day the hum first echoed beneath her chamber floor, except this time it was worry about losing something rather than fear of an unknown threat. "I would ask you to stay close to me," she said quietly. "Not as my maid, not exactly as my guard, though I suspect you have earned that title several times over by now. Simply as someone I trust, more than any warrior my family has ever hired, someone who sees danger before it arrives and refuses to look away once it does." I thought about 3 years of pouring nectar in silent hallways, of being invisible furniture to warriors who never once imagined a human could matter, of a hum beneath the floor that nobody else had bothered to hear. I thought about Grace's steady grip in the darkness the night before the gala, telling me not to wait for permission to act. I thought about my grandfather's stories told long before humanity had ever left its own solar system, about how the smallest, most overlooked soldier in any army could still be the one who changed everything. "I will stay," I said, "not because of rank and not because of protection under Cathari law. I will stay because you were the first person in this entire palace who ever looked at me and saw more than a maid carrying a tray." Vesa smiled, real and unguarded. The same smile I had first seen weeks earlier before any of this had begun. "Then it seems, Ella Whitmore, that the 200 years of unbroken Cathari peace ended the exact same night a new kind of protection finally began. Below us, the capital's lights flickered on across the darkening city. And somewhere in that vast palace, warriors twice my size were already training differently than they ever had before, learning that strength alone had never been the only thing that mattered in a fight. Sometimes it was simply the willingness to notice what everyone else had decided was not worth seeing at all, and the refusal to stand still once you finally understood exactly what that quiet, overlooked thing had been building toward all along. I had come to that palace 3 years earlier as nothing more than a servant carrying trays through polished stone hallways. I left that balcony as something the Cathari Dominion had never once expected to need, and would never again make the mistake of underestimating. A human standing quietly in the room,